Hi everyone, welcome back to DFTW, a channel to see the world from a different angle. We upload videos daily, 7 to 9 a week. Please subscribe to our channels to receive notifications for regular updates. Today we talk about the Ukraine war, as it's entering the 5th year shortly. It is a strange war indeed, as everyone claims he is winning, but no one is happy, and involved parties, including Russia, Ukraine, the US, China, India and many others, can't leave the table. By January 2026, the Ukraine war officially entered the phase every strategist secretly dreads but publicly pretends doesn't exist, the forever phase. On paper it still looks like a war. Drones fly, refineries explode, and maps change color by day and by night. In reality, it has become more like a managed condition, like chronic inflation, climate change conferences, or airport security lines. Everyone complains, nobody can end it, and the system is now optimized for continuity rather than resolution. Russia is advancing inch by inch on the battlefield, but the country and its people are becoming poorer. Ukraine is bravely resisting, but soldiers, civilians, and politicians are all exhausted. The United States had been offering necessary help for the sake of the Nobel Peace Prize right up to the last minute, while billing everyone else to maximize its profit. Now it's trying to maintain the status quo on the battlefield, as it has done in the Taiwan Strait over the past decades. China seems neutral while nervously counting the kilometers of the shared border and learning from Putin's mistakes that have prolonged the initial special military action into a tug-of-war between Russia and the collective West. And the war itself has become a game that is never over. In the vast land filled with fire and blood, the victory or failure over one village, one street, or a community doesn't decide anything anymore. What happens in the trenches matters less than what happens in budget spreadsheets. Russian forces still grind forward in Donbass. Ukrainian units still hold villages with names nobody outside the region can pronounce. And artillery continues to pour down shells in industrial quantities. But none of this decides the war's outcome anymore. The front line has become a price discovery mechanism. Every kilometer costs Russia a certain number of shells, soldiers, rubles, and political headaches. Every Ukrainian defensive success costs Washington a certain number of missiles, congressional arguments, and think tank reports. Neither side is fighting to win outright, but to prove the other side is paying more per unit of progress. Russia still has artillery dominance, but its returns are diminishing. Russians can only destroy the same Ukrainian village so many times before it becomes rubble with no military value. Ukraine, for its part, has mastered the art of not collapsing, which turns out to be far more strategically useful than winning spectacular victories. And then there's the issue of foreign participants. North Korean units reportedly entering the battlefield is less a sign of Russian strength than of Russian arithmetic. When domestic labor runs out, Moscow imports hands from abroad, just like factories hire contractors. The only difference is that these workers come armed with rifles rather than toolkits. The irony is hard to miss. Russia, which went to war partly to prove it wasn't isolated, is now outsourcing frontline military service to one of the few countries even more sanctioned than itself. The battlefield still bleeds. But it no longer decides anything but bleeding. Currently, Russia's economy is technically alive but strategically unwell. If supermarket shelves decided wars, Russia would be winning. Goods are available. The lights are on. The state still pays salaries. Russian people seem happier than their previous brothers and sisters in Ukraine. If wars were decided by long-term economic health, Russia would already be writing memoirs about what went wrong. Official inflation numbers hover around 5%, which is adorable. Anyone who shops for food knows the real number is noticeably worse than last year, and worse again next month. GDP growth of around 1% is presented as a sign of resilience. In reality, it's a flat line dressed up in military camouflage. Wartime economies are supposed to grow fast because you're burning money at industrial speed. When they don't, it means the engine is overheating while the car isn't moving. Then there's the ruble. A 45% appreciation sounds impressive until you realize it's achieved the same way you'd lose weight by cutting off your legs. Capital controls trap money inside the country, artificially boosting demand for the currency. Imports shrink. Exports suffer. Congratulations, your currency is strong despite your weaker economy. Russian energy exports, once the pride of the state, have become a logistical and financial obstacle course. Oil still flows, but through shadow fleets, discounts, and diplomatic gymnastics that would impress an Olympic judge. Because of Trump's tariff threats, India is buying less Russian oil. As a result, China is absorbing more Russian oil while India and Turkey cut back. Reports say China is restarting a refinery in Dalian to process Russian oil. That is also one of the reasons why China needs Russia to stay strong, so Putin doesn't lose the war. At the same time, the Russian government raises taxes to fund a war it insists is going great. If Putin were running a company, investors would already be gone. One of the least dramatic but most devastating effects of the war is Russia's labor crisis, which is no better than Ukraine's. Young men are either fighting in trenches, working in defense factories, or leaving the country. Private businesses are now competing with the state for workers and losing them. When the government is willing to pay whatever it takes to keep the war going, the market becomes irrelevant. Inflation follows. Productivity drops. Everyone loses except the spreadsheet that says defense spending increased. Demographics, unlike sanctions, cannot be bypassed. You can't bring back a lost generation or fast forward a 3-day-old baby to a 20-year-old soldier. Even if the war ended tomorrow, which it won't, Russia would still face decades of economic drag simply because the people who were supposed to build the future are gone. That is not a collapse. It's worse. It's stagnation with a flag. From Washington's perspective, the war is going remarkably well, precisely because it never ends. That is why Donald Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours during the campaign, but in reality, he could not keep his word a year after returning to the White House. The Trump administration's approach strips away moral language, leaving only pure transaction. Ukraine is not a crusade. It's an asset. Military aid is calibrated with surgical precision, enough to keep Ukraine standing, not enough to let it sprint. It is not confusion. It's deliberately designed. A Ukrainian victory would destabilize Russia too much. A Russian victory would destabilize Europe too much. A long war destabilizes everyone else just enough to remain dependent on the United States. That is what strategists call balance. Everyone else calls it exhausting. The proposed peace frameworks are masterpieces of diplomatic irony. They promise security in exchange for territory, stability in exchange for permanent grievance. They are designed not to be accepted, but to be blamed on the other side. And that's the key point. Washington doesn't need peace. It needs leverage. As long as Russia bleeds slowly, Europe stays nervous, NATO stays relevant, and American influence stays indispensable. From a purely cynical perspective, it's hard to beat. The war is called the Ukraine War, but Ukraine itself is an agency without options. Kiev is often described as fighting for its survival, which is true but incomplete. Ukraine is also fighting inside a narrow corridor of allowed actions. Every offensive, every defensive line, every escalation is quietly bounded by what its sponsors will tolerate. Publicly, Ukrainian leadership must reject territorial concessions. Politically, they have no choice. No government survives signing away land soaked in blood. Privately, they understand the limits. Aid packages come with fine print. Deadlines exist even when they are removed. Strategic autonomy is real but conditional. Ukraine is not powerless. But it is not free. That is the tragedy of proxy wars. Sovereignty is preserved rhetorically and constrained operationally. From what the US is doing in Ukraine, we can figure out what it wants Taiwan to do if Beijing cannot take over the island in 2 or 3 weeks, although Taiwan itself cannot withstand Beijing's attacks long enough like the Ukrainians. Then, let us say something about China. President Xi Jinping's position looks contradictory only if we ignore geography. Beijing does not support the war. It does not want Russia to win big, as a stronger Russia has been a threat to the Chinese, worse than the British and Americans. However, a fragmented Russia is not a geopolitical opportunity for China, it's a nightmare. Thousands of kilometers of unstable border, loose nuclear materials, competing factions, and Western influence rushing in would create exactly the kind of strategic environment Beijing spends its life trying to avoid. So China does what it does best: stabilize without committing. Trade continues, but on China's terms. Energy purchases continue or expand but are discounted. Diplomatic language emphasizes peace but avoids deadlines, as Beijing does not interfere in other countries' internal affairs, unlike another superpower. Chinese companies tread carefully because asset seizures have taught everyone an important lesson: when states panic, contracts mean very little. China's goal is not to save Russia. It's to prevent a vacuum. President Xi Jinping and President Putin are good friends, but friendship is also conditional, as it does not override interests. Here's the uncomfortable punchline: the war continues because ending it is riskier than managing it. Russia can't win decisively without provoking greater intervention. It can't lose decisively without risking internal collapse. The United States can't let Russia recover. But it can't let Russia implode either. China can't let Russia fall. But it can't fully embrace it either. Ukraine can't accept peace terms that involve territorial cessions. But it can't force victory. Everyone is stuck. The war has become a geopolitical holding pattern, burning resources, lives, and credibility at a controlled rate. The future is now constrained by American pacing, Chinese caution, Ukrainian resistance, and Russian desperation. Decisions are reactions. Strategies are adjustments. That is not how great powers are supposed to function. And yet, the system persists because everyone else benefits just enough, especially the US and China. The prolonged war means a weaker Russian and a more fragmented Europe for Americans. It also means discounted energy and a strategic vacuum for the Chinese. The Ukraine war will not end with a treaty that satisfies anyone. It will fade, pause, freeze, and mutate. It will become managed instability, the polite term for an unresolved disaster. The irony is brutal. Russia fights with blood to restore sovereignty and loses control of its destiny. The US fights a proxy war for stability and engineers permanent tension. China preaches non-interference while quietly preventing Russia from failing too fast. Ukraine fights heroically and discovers heroism has ceilings. The promised freedom and military umbrella are too pricey, and they never came. There are no winners here. Only survivors. And in modern geopolitics, survival, managed, prolonged, and exhausted, is often the best deal anyone is allowed to get.